June 12, 1944. 11:15 hours. Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Carl Hoffman stepped off the army truck into morning air that smelled of manure and fresh-cut hay, rather than diesel fuel and barbed wire. 23 other German prisoners climbed down behind him, their faded Afrika Korps uniforms marking them as veterans of campaigns in North Africa, who'd been captured by British forces in Tunisia 15 months earlier and transferred to American custody after processing through camps in England. They'd crossed the Atlantic expecting prison camps with guard towers and work details breaking rocks. Not this. Farmland stretching toward horizons in every direction, barns painted red, and fields showing the first green shoots of crops planted 6 weeks earlier. The camp guards stayed with the truck, rifles slung casually over shoulders rather than held at ready positions. A group of American farmers stood near a tobacco barn, watching the prisoners with expressions that Carl couldn't interpret. Not hostile exactly, but not welcoming either. Wary, calculating, measuring whether Germans who'd fought for Hitler could be trusted with farm work that was simultaneously simple physical labor and essential to feeding a nation at war. One farmer stepped forward, a man in his 50s with weathered skin and hands that showed decades of outdoor work. He spoke in English that Carl barely understood, the Pennsylvania Dutch accent, making words even more difficult to parse than the classroom German Carl had learned during mandatory school lessons. But the gesture was clear enough. The farmer pointed to himself, then to his fields, then to the prisoners. Work. You're here to work. Carl had been a mechanic in the Afrika Korps, maintaining trucks and armored vehicles for Rommel's forces during the North Africa campaign. He'd expected American captivity to mean hard labor in mines or factories, possibly digging ditches or building roads under harsh conditions that matched stories German soldiers told about Soviet prisoner treatment. Instead, he was apparently being assigned to agricultural work on a farm that looked prosperous by any standard, let alone by comparison to the subsistence farming he'd grown up with in rural Bavaria. The cognitive dissonance was immediate and disorienting. These Americans should hate him. He'd fought their soldiers. He'd been part of the military machine trying to help Germany conquer Europe. He represented everything their propaganda said was evil about Nazi Germany. Instead, they were handing him a hoe and gesturing toward rows of young tobacco plants that needed weeding. The first days of mutual suspicion. The Lancaster County farmers who'd agreed to use POW labor did so from necessity rather than enthusiasm. The local community included many families of German descent, Pennsylvania Dutch, whose ancestors had emigrated from Germany in the 18th and 19th centuries. But that cultural connection didn't translate to sympathy for Hitler's Germany or comfort with hosting enemy prisoners. James Stoltzfus, the farmer who'd been designated to coordinate POW work assignments for a consortium of 12 neighboring farms, had lost his nephew at Normandy 3 weeks earlier. The telegram had arrived while he was planting corn, and he'd finished the field before allowing himself to process the news that Frank wouldn't be coming home. Now he was supervising German prisoners who might have killed American soldiers like Frank, might have fired the shots that turned young men into casualty statistics, might represent the enemy in human form rather than abstract concept. The first morning's work was tense and silent. Stoltzfus demonstrated weeding technique, working down a tobacco row while the prisoners watched. Then he gestured for them to start on adjacent rows, establishing rhythm that kept Germans and Americans working in parallel rather than integrated patterns. The separation was deliberate. Keep them close enough to supervise, far enough to avoid unnecessary interaction that might create problems. Carl Hoffman took a row and began working, focusing on the physical task rather than the psychological complexity of the situation. Weeding tobacco was straightforward manual labor. Identify unwanted plants between the crop rows, pull them out by roots, move forward. The work was repetitive, physically demanding in the June heat, and utterly familiar to someone who'd grown up helping with harvest on his family's small Bavarian farm. After 2 hours, one of the American farmers walked down Carl's row, checking work quality. The farmer nodded, approval without words, and moved on to inspect other rows. Carl felt unexpected satisfaction from the acknowledgement. He'd been a good mechanic in the Africa Corps, had taken pride in keeping vehicles operational under desert conditions that destroyed equipment. Now he was a good agricultural worker, which shouldn't have mattered, but somehow did anyway. By lunchtime, the prisoners had completed 6 rows each, matching the pace set by American workers who'd been farming for decades. Stoltzfus studied the completed work, comparing German performance to what his regular hired hands would have accomplished. The quality was acceptable, the speed adequate, and nobody had caused problems or required excessive supervision. The morning had been successful by any practical measure. The farmers ate lunch sitting on hay bales near the barn, talking quietly among themselves, while the prisoners ate separately near the truck that had delivered them. The segregation was automatic, reflecting assumptions on both sides that mixing would be uncomfortable or inappropriate. But the physical separation was less than 50 feet, close enough that both groups were aware of each other, conscious of the parallels between farmers eating sandwiches and prisoners consuming Red Cross rations that matched American military field rations. Sarah Stoltzfus, James's wife, had watched the morning's work from the farmhouse kitchen window. She'd packed extra sandwiches that morning, uncertain whether prisoners would be fed adequately, but unwilling to have hungry people working on their property. At 12:30 hours, she walked to where the prisoners sat and set down a basket containing sandwiches, apples, and a thermos of coffee. The prisoners stared at the basket, then at Sarah, clearly uncertain whether the food was actually for them or some elaborate test. Sarah made a gesture that transcended language barriers. "Eat. It's for you." One prisoner, an older man who'd been a corporal based on the insignia still visible on his worn uniform, stood and spoke in German that Sarah didn't understand, except for the tone, which was clearly gratitude. "Danke schön." "Thank you kindly." Sarah nodded and returned to the farmhouse, uncomfortable with the gratitude, but also satisfied that she'd done what seemed right, regardless of whether these men were enemies or just hungry people far from home. The arithmetic of necessity. American agriculture in 1944 faced crisis that threatened food production essential for both domestic consumption and military supply overseas. The war had removed approximately 4 million farm workers from agriculture, young men who'd enlisted or been drafted, leaving behind farms that couldn't maintain pre-war production levels, with reduced labor forces consisting primarily of women, older men, and teenagers too young for military service. The federal government's response was pragmatic to the point of radical: use enemy prisoners of war as agricultural labor under conditions that violated traditional assumptions about how captive enemies should be treated. The Geneva Convention permitted POW labor under specific conditions that prohibited dangerous work, required fair compensation, and mandated treatment comparable to the captor nation's own soldiers. American implementation went beyond these minimum requirements, creating a system where German prisoners worked alongside American farmers in conditions that often resembled employment more than imprisonment. By mid-1944, the United States held approximately 378,000 German prisoners distributed across more than 500 camps located in 43 states. The vast majority were Africa Corps veterans captured during Tunisia campaign, or soldiers taken prisoner during the Italian campaign that was grinding slowly northward through mountainous terrain. These weren't fanatical SS troops or committed Nazis. They were regular Wehrmacht personnel, many conscripted rather than volunteering, who'd found themselves on the losing side of battles where surrender to Americans or British seemed preferable to death. The program's scale was extraordinary. During 1944 and 1945, German POWs contributed approximately 90 million man-hours to American agriculture, equivalent to the annual labor of 45,000 full-time workers. They harvested crops, maintained equipment, processed agricultural products, and performed essentially every task required for farming operations except management decisions that remained firmly in American hands. The language of shared labor. The barriers between German prisoners and American farmers eroded gradually rather than dramatically, worn away by daily contact that revealed human similarities more obvious than ideological differences. The erosion happened through small moments rather than grand gestures, shared tasks that required cooperation, mutual respect that developed from competent work, and recognition that enemy soldiers could be decent people trapped by circumstances they hadn't chosen. By the third week, the rigid segregation had relaxed noticeably. Prisoners and Americans worked side by side rather than in separate groups. Conversations developed despite language barriers, combinations of broken English, forgotten German, and universal gestures that communicated practical information about tasks at hand. The interactions remained focused on work rather than personal subjects, but the tone had shifted from suspicious supervision to something approaching collaborative effort. Karl Hoffmann discovered that one of the younger American farmers, Robert Miller, spoke functional German learned from his grandparents, who'd immigrated from Bavaria in 1898. Miller had avoided speaking German since the war started, not wanting to seem sympathetic to the enemy. But practical necessity overcame political caution when he realized that direct communication could improve work efficiency. Miller and Karl began working adjacent rows, Miller translating Stoltzfus's instructions and explaining farming techniques that weren't obvious to someone whose agricultural experience came from small-scale subsistence farming rather than commercial tobacco production. The conversations remained strictly professional initially. How to identify disease in tobacco leaves, when to harvest based on leaf color, how to cure tobacco properly to maximize quality. But professional conversations naturally expanded to include personal information that humanized both sides. Karl mentioned that he'd been a mechanic before the war, maintaining farm equipment along with automotive vehicles. Miller mentioned that their threshing machine had been malfunctioning, and the local mechanic couldn't identify the problem. Karl offered to examine it during lunch break. The threshing machine repair became a turning point that shifted relationships from wary cooperation to genuine collaboration. Karl diagnosed the problem within 15 minutes. A worn bearing in the drive shaft that was causing friction and reducing power transmission. The repair required parts that weren't immediately available, but Karl showed Miller how to fabricate a temporary replacement using materials available on the farm. The improvised repair worked, keeping the machine operational through the remainder of the season. Stoltzfus watched Karl work on the machinery with the focused intensity of someone who genuinely understood mechanical systems, rather than just following procedures. The competence was obvious and valuable. Good mechanics were increasingly rare, with so many skilled workers in military service. The fact that this particular mechanic was an enemy prisoner became less relevant than the practical reality that he could fix equipment the farm depended on. The storm that changed everything. July 28, 1944, 15:45 hours, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. The summer thunderstorm appeared on the western horizon with minimal warning. Dark clouds building rapidly, lightning visible even in afternoon daylight, and wind that shifted from gentle breeze to strong gusts within minutes. Stoltzfus recognized immediately that the storm would be severe, and that the tobacco crop currently in the middle of crucial growing stage could be devastated by hail or high winds that would shred leaves and destroy months of work. The response required speed rather than careful planning. Stoltzfus shouted instructions to everyone in the fields, Americans and Germans alike, directing them to harvest what they could immediately and cover remaining plants with protective tarps stored in the barn. The work required coordination across 12 acres of tobacco, with multiple teams working simultaneously to save as much of the crop as possible before the storm arrived. Karl and 3 other German prisoners ran to the barn, grabbed armfuls of tarps, and began spreading them over tobacco rows, while American farmers harvested plants that were close enough to maturity that early cutting would be preferable to storm damage. The organization was chaotic, but effective, everyone working without regard to nationality or prisoner status, because the immediate necessity of saving the crop overrode all other considerations. The storm hit with intensity that exceeded initial expectations. Hail the size of marbles fell for 12 minutes, destroying anything unprotected, and testing whether tarps secured hastily over plants would hold against wind gusts exceeding 40 miles per hour. Rain followed the hail, soaking everyone who'd been too focused on protecting crops to seek shelter. When the storm passed, the assessment showed that coordinated emergency response had saved approximately 70% of the tobacco crop. The remaining 30% had been lost to hail damage or wind that had torn leaves beyond commercial value. Without the rapid response from everyone available, Americans and Germans working together without hesitation, the losses would have been catastrophic rather than manageable. Stoltzfus stood in the field assessing damage while rain dripped from his hat. The German prisoners stood nearby, equally soaked, equally exhausted from 45 minutes of intense physical labor under conditions that had been genuinely dangerous. The hail had left bruises on everyone who'd been caught without adequate cover. One prisoner had a cut on his forehead from debris blown by wind. Miller had twisted his ankle while running with tarps. Stoltzfus looked at Karl and the other prisoners, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time since they'd arrived 6 weeks earlier. These weren't abstractions labeled enemy, or Nazi, or German soldier. They were men who'd just worked alongside Americans to save crops, who'd risked injury from hail and debris without hesitation, who'd demonstrated the same commitment to protecting the harvest that his own neighbors had shown. He walked to where Karl stood and extended his hand. Karl hesitated, uncertain about the gesture, then accepted the handshake. Stoltzfus said in English that Karl probably didn't fully understand. "Thank you. You saved my farm today." Karl responded in German that Stoltzfus didn't understand, but the meaning was clear enough from tone and expression. They'd worked together. The crop was saved. Whatever else divided them mattered less than that shared accomplishment. The harvest season. August through October 1944 represented peak agricultural labor period when crops matured and needed harvesting within narrow time windows that determined economic success or failure. The German prisoners worked alongside American farmers through tobacco harvest, corn cutting, and vegetable processing that filled daylight hours with physical labor that left everyone exhausted by nightfall. The relationships that had developed during summer work solidified into patterns that resembled employment more than imprisonment. The prisoners arrived each morning, worked assigned tasks with minimal supervision, ate lunch with American farm families who'd stopped maintaining strict segregation, and returned to their camp each evening. The guards who'd initially accompanied them everywhere now typically remained with the transport trucks, recognizing that the prisoners had no particular reason to escape, and multiple practical reasons to maintain the arrangement that provided better food, treatment, and working conditions than any realistic alternative. Some prisoners received permission to work directly for individual farmers, rather than through the centralized assignment system, living in farm bunkhouses, and integrating almost completely into normal agricultural employment, except for their legal status as POWs. Karl Hoffmann was one of these, moving into spare quarters above Stoltzfus's barn, and becoming the farm's primary mechanic and general maintenance specialist. The arrangement benefited everyone involved. Stoltzfus gained access to mechanical expertise that would have been prohibitively expensive to hire commercially. Karl received treatment comparable to hired farmhand rather than imprisoned enemy, including better food, more freedom of movement, and work that utilized his actual skills rather than just his physical labor. The Army benefited from reduced costs of housing and supervising a prisoner who was essentially self-sufficient and causing no security concerns. The moral complexity of the situation was obvious, but rarely discussed explicitly. Karl was still legally a prisoner of war, still technically an enemy of the United States, still subject to repatriation to Germany whenever the war ended. But daily reality bore little resemblance to these legal classifications. He ate meals with the Stoltzfus family, attended church services with them on Sundays, and helped young David Stoltzfus with homework that involved mechanical problems Karl could explain better than the boy's teacher. Sarah Stoltzfus found herself serving dinner to a man who might have shot at her nephew during combat, might have contributed to killing American soldiers, might represent everything she'd been told to hate about Germany. But the man sitting at her table was polite, helpful, and obviously homesick for family he hadn't seen in 2 years. The contradiction between enemy soldier and decent person couldn't be resolved through abstract logic, so she simply treated him as a guest who happened to be legally classified as a prisoner. The economics of enemy labor. The POW labor program operated under financial arrangements that revealed interesting tensions between prisoner rights and practical economics. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners receive compensation for their work, though at rates substantially below what free labor would command. German POWs working in American agriculture earned 80 cents per day, a rate that was simultaneously exploitation by free market standards and generous compared to typical POW labor programs in other countries. The 80 cents was paid in scrip usable only at prison camp canteens rather than real currency, limiting what prisoners could purchase, but providing access to cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and other items that improved quality and technical skills useful for reconstruction. Karl received notification in January 1946 that he would be repatriated in March. The 4-month delay gave him time to prepare for departure and allowed the Stoltzfus family to process the reality that their farm's mechanic and de facto family member would be leaving. The final weeks were emotionally complicated for everyone involved. Karl had spent 20 months living on the farm, longer than many hired workers stayed in agricultural employment. He'd become integrated into daily operations in ways that would create genuine hardship when he departed. The farm needed a mechanic, and finding someone with Karl's skills and work ethic would be difficult in peacetime labor markets where workers had multiple employment options. But beyond practical concerns were personal relationships that couldn't be easily replaced. Sarah Stoltzfus had taught Karl to cook American dishes. Young David had learned basic German from Karl while helping with farm work. James had come to rely on Karl's judgment about mechanical issues and equipment purchases. The departure day in early March 1946 was awkward and subdued. The army truck that arrived to transport Karl to the repatriation processing center in New York represented ending that everyone had known was coming, but nobody had quite prepared for emotionally. Karl packed his few possessions, mostly clothing and small gifts the family had given him over months, into a canvas bag provided by the army. Sarah gave him a package of food for the journey. David handed him a drawing he'd made showing the farm. James extended his hand for a handshake that lasted longer than necessary. "You're welcome to come back." James' life beyond basic necessities. Most prisoners accumulated scrip savings over months of work, using the artificial currency to purchase small luxuries that made captivity more tolerable. American farmers paid the federal government for POW labor at rates approximating what they would have paid hired workers, with the difference between full wages and the 80 cents actually paid to prisoners going to the War Department to offset costs of operating the POW program. The arrangement created profit center that helped fund the camps while providing farmers with access to labor that would have been unavailable at any price due to wartime shortages. The economics were pragmatic rather than principled, reflecting calculation that prisoners represented resource that could be exploited for mutual benefit. The prisoners received treatment better than most POWs in history, and substantially better than Axis powers provided to Allied prisoners. The farmers received labor essential for maintaining agricultural production. The federal government reduced net costs of the POW program while supporting domestic food supply. But the economic efficiency couldn't completely obscure the moral awkwardness of profiting from enemy labor, particularly when some prisoners worked alongside Americans in conditions virtually identical to normal employment, except for legal status and compensation. The system worked practically while remaining ethically complicated. The repatriation that revealed everything. German POWs began returning to Europe in late 1945, processed through repatriation centers that handled the administrative complexity of returning hundreds of thousands of prisoners to a country divided into occupation zones and still recovering from total military defeat. The process was slow, with priority given to prisoners who had families in accessible areas, James said quietly. "After things settle down, if you want to." Karl nodded, uncertain whether the invitation was genuine possibility or just kind thing to say during difficult moment. "Thank you for everything. You treated me better than I deserved." "You earned it," James replied. You worked hard. You helped save my farm. That deserves respect, regardless of politics." Carl climbed into the truck. The vehicle drove away toward the camp, where he would be processed along with dozens of other prisoners preparing for repatriation. The Stoltzfus family stood watching until the truck disappeared, then returned to daily work that suddenly felt incomplete without the German mechanic who'd become part of their lives.